Friends, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Kaushik Basu, whom I know for many years. But apart from the personal angle to this, I'm very happy that we have such an eminent economist to address this overflowing, enthusiastic gathering for the colloquia. I might like to say that Professor Basu is very well known for his research, technical research. But that's not the only thing for which he is known. Professor Basu is a prolific writer, and many of you must have read his pieces on popular pieces in newspapers, magazines, and they deal not merely with economics, but you might say on a wide range of issues, some of which are economics related, but some of his columns and these have come out in the form of a book. What's it called? The People of Places. If you read that collection, you'll find that his interests are wide-ranging. Added to this, he has one quality which I should share with you, having sat through a few of his lectures and seminars, etc., which is his expository skills. So for all these reasons, as you can guess, he is a very, very popular lecturer, teacher. He has had an illustrious career in the academic line. For many years, of course, he was a star faculty in the Delhi School of Economics. Currently, he is teaching in Cornell. He has visited top universities in the US. He's a student, of course, of the London School of Economics, and his thesis was completed under Professor Amartya Sen. I don't think I need to say much more about him. It's best that he speaks for himself. So with these few words, let us welcome Professor Kaushik Basu to this colloquia.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that very generous introduction. Indeed, I've known him for a very long time as a friend and also as a professional colleague in the sense of the economics professional community. I'm having to do a change of gear for me, a very sudden and unexpected one, because I really, from the discussion I had, I was expecting a small round table where we sort of groups of us would sit around and talk about careers in economics a little bit and the Indian economy and its prospects a little bit. But it's a bigger audience and I'm addressing you as a group instead of sitting in a round table. So let me change the sequence and instead of talking about me, career and economics, I'll be happy to come to that, careers in economics, teaching, etc. Let me first speak about the Indian economy and my expectations from the Indian economy. And why did I do that for about 20 minutes? Speak a little bit about the career in economics since I was told to speak about that. And then ask me questions and whichever direction that the questions take us to, we go follow. The Indian economy, for me, is an interest rather late in my career. My interest in economics, basically what drew me into economics is the abstract beauty of the subject. It's a subject with great elegance and it sort of draws you in if you're so inclined. And I never planned to be an economist because really the elegance of the subject that drew me in. The interest in the Indian economy for me arose roughly around 1991, and it's to do with the Indian economy a little bit, I think. I was at the Delhi School of Economics at that stage, and as everybody knows, that there was dramatic changes in the Indian economy in 1991. There were changes which were being hotly debated, And for the first time, I took a position on the debate, public position on the debate that was taking place. On most matters, it's so difficult to have a view, something that even plagues me today, that if someone asks that this budget, is it going to help the Indian economy or not? Really, if you search your mind on most such matters, the answer is I don't know. It's just too complex an organism, the Indian economy. The budget is too many things happening in the budget, so a simple answer you don't know. But I remember a piece of advice which Government had given somewhere, that when a journalist comes up and asks your view on something, even if you don't have a view, give them a view, because otherwise they won't come back the next year to ask for your view, and by then you may have a view. So in the beginning, I must say, so I was sort of forcing myself to engage with the Indian economy. But I personally have felt that the reforms on balance, with all the ifs and buts and provisos, the reforms on balance were worth it. The reforms that were being tried in 1991 by the then finance minister, who's now the prime minister of the country, Manmohan Singh, I thought it was something that was high time. And I took up some public positions then, and came under a lot of attack and criticism for the public position I had taken, including one at the Indian Statistical IIM Calcutta soon after I had taken that line, and that sort of drew me in. So I remain a great optimist about India, and I was one of the early optimists, because once the 1991 reforms started out, I somehow felt that the economy is going to take off. And Indian takeoff, I remember actually when in the sort of mid-1990s I was writing that in some sense India's taken off already. People did not believe. But you can understand this because takeoffs, though unlike airline takeoffs, if you're sitting in an aircraft, when it takes off, you immediately know the plane has taken off. The takeoff of a country is almost always clear in retrospect. There are too many multiplicity of changes taking place in a country, so there's too much noise, so you don't pick up. For instance, China, we now know China took off. 1978 to 1980, somewhere around then China took off, but well into the sort of early 90s, people were still debating, has China really taken off? No one is debating now. China has taken off. Even after a takeoff, there can be a crash and an economy can stop, but China is booming. India, today over the, I think over the last 3-4 years, there is consensus that India has taken off. It's trailing way behind China, it was a takeoff later, and it is almost certainly it's a takeoff from around 1991, 1992. But let me give you a bit of the background of the sort of figures, and then I'll tell you why I feel optimistic today about India, about the overall picture of India, and why I do feel that there are some very worrying signs, nevertheless, about the economy. When actually first of all, let me mix the two. One reason for optimism is the fact that if you just study the growth figures, if you're looking at one overarching figure for the economy, yes, with all the hesitations that we express about per capita growth, that you should look at other things, not just per capita income growth, we still know that, yes, if you're looking at one figure, that is perhaps the most important figure for a country. Certainly you shouldn't stop there. You want to look at distribution, you want to look at the standard of living, etc. But if you just look at the growth figures, some dispute about when it kicked off. But the big, actually, growth spike took place during a period which to most Indians is a black box in our head. We don't like to talk about that. 1975 to 76, the economy suddenly actually grew very rapidly, and you people are young enough, but it was a sort of, psychologically it was a crisis for Indians at that stage, because it was the year of Indira Gandhi, 25th of June, taking over dictatorial control over the country. It was the 2-year dictatorship that the country has seen. The first year of those 2 years, India saw a huge growth burst. But it was not just a one-time spike, and I don't think actually, it was loosely connected to the emergency that was declared. That did have some impact, and not that one commends the emergency on the ground that it did well on one indicator. There were horrible things that were happening, and there were other things that had happened in the economy which I think caused the growth spurt over there. There were 2-3 good years, then one very big dip. Then from about the early 1980s, in fact, one very interesting thing about the Indian economy, if you write down the growth rate in every year from 1947 till today, like on all such real life scatters, there are lots of points going up and down, the growth in every year. In fact, to the naked eye, you will not really see a trend of the growth rate going up. But if you look at it carefully, you'll notice what's happened is that the bottom drops that used to take place, that's picked up. In fact, after 1980, India has never had a year with negative growth, which is actually quite a remarkable achievement even across the country. Very few countries have done a round of 26 years without a single year with a negative growth. India's never had a negative growth from 1980. Whereas from 1947 to 1980, there were 4 years when India had a negative growth. The economy actually shrank. That has not happened since 1980. So there is a group of, so 1975 is a bit of a step up in growth rate. There are some people who will say that actually it's from 1981 that really the growth rate takes place, and then it's been sustained growth. India broke away from the famous Hindu rate of growth, which used to be 3.5%, growing at about, not per capita income, I'm talking of national income, growing at about 5.2, 5.3% from 1981 onwards, very steadily. So some kind of change had taken place. The next step up in the growth rate takes place around 1993. 1991, 1992, 1993 are the sort of, it's the period of reforms, major reforms, but 1991 was a crisis year. It was a positive growth rate, but slender positive growth rate, 0.5 or something like that. But growth rate suddenly picked up in 1993, 1994, and then there was a 3-year real growth spurt, crossing 7% per annum. Then in 1997 it goes down again, but it's not too surprising. 1997 is a bit of a landmark year for the world, because the world was shocked into an East Asian crisis. There was a belief that no matter where a crisis takes place, East Asia is robust and will continue to grow. But Thailand, Malaysia, Korea, 5 countries primarily, Indonesia and the Philippines, spun into a massive crisis from 1997, and India felt some of the shock, but still India grew very well. Not too much for credit to India. The reason is India was still not exposed internationally. We were always a closed economy. Mercifully for India, in terms of culture and intellectual activity, India has been an extremely open country, which is just wonderful for this country. But as far as the economy goes, it's been an extremely closed economy. It's gradually opening up. 80s was an opening up, but 1991 to 93 was a major opening up. Then the growth rate picks up, and over the last 3 years, the economy is doing very well, so tending to clear 8% per annum. When did the real boom in the economy take place? I myself put it down to the reforms of the 1991 to 1993. One of the reasons is my own fear is what was happening in the 1980s with Sanjay Gandhi playing a role and all, is that India could have spun into crony capitalism. A fear that I think every country has to live with at all situations, that small groups of big business can capture a country's growth plan and growth agenda, something that the United States has to worry about. And there are a couple of companies extremely powerful, cornering all the allocation of contracts being given in Iraq. There are American companies which are tending to corner. And of course a third world country has to worry about the fact that crony capitalism can break out, where it will be really a mess for the economy, with a couple of companies and a very small group of rich people doing very well. We've seen this happen in Indonesia, we've seen this happen in the Philippines, we've seen this happen in Latin America. My own fear is that the 80s reform in India had a bit of a risk of the crony capital, a big risk of crony capitalism. There's always some risk. From 1991 to 1993, and I'm partial towards the finance minister, I think he came in with a lot of good left-wing consciousness, which I think is very good. I mean, he was aware of the fact that India has large masses of people. In the end, the ultimate aim of the country has to be, you want a lot of boom, but you want it really because you want the large masses to benefit. He went in for a set of reforms, Manmohan Singh, which really sparked off major changes in that country. An economy is such a complex character that I really envy people who are born right-wing or born left-wing, because then everything is ideologically determined and you know the answers, but life is more complex. Is openness good for India? I think on balance it is. But again, we have this not just from academics, but even industrialists and entrepreneurs will tell you. Narayan Murthy has been on record writing about this. In fact, one of the writings is in a book that I've edited. There is a piece by a speech that Azim Premji gave, all referring to the same thing, that India's software boom owes a bit to closeness and also owes a lot to openness. When IBM was thrown out, it was suddenly that you had to fend for yourself, and it was a classic infant industry argument that India had to develop some of these technologies, some of these skills to be able to do well. And that was probably a very crucial input. But if India remained closed, then the boom that took place would not have taken place. So 1991, when India opened up, with that little bit of infant industry nurture that had taken place in the software sector, the opening up came as a blessing. Along with that, there are things which you can't even give credit to someone because these are just pieces of luck. India's heavy investment in higher education, which for a long time was thought of as unnecessary because there were engineers without jobs, there were people being trained in management but not really getting very good jobs. This happened with this overeducation. Then Silicon Valley started booming. The demand there picked up. India had a history of very good higher education. India was in a position to supply in a way that really no other third world country had. So there was this cheap, highly skilled labor, and the boom sparked off in India. I have to say there's a lot of connection with the United States, whether one likes it or not, and one has to admit that actually that has helped India a lot. The Silicon Valley boom, in fact many people say that the United States does not recognize enough, but will perhaps one day recognize, that there was a time when it was appearing that the US could get overtaken by Japan in terms of per capita income. The automobile industry had declined, America seemed to be at the crossroads, but the huge H-1B visa that the United States opened up, and the H-1B visa was disproportionately going to Indians. I was studying a particular period from the late 1990s of the H-1B visas that the United States was giving out. Little over 50% was going to Indians because of the large body of professionals. In fact, the next biggest group was China with 9% of H-1B visas. So disproportionate amount of Indians going into Silicon Valley and that area, which actually allowed America, the openness policy, allowed America to really prop up growth and fight off, if that's the right word. Well, that's one of the most benign uses one can put the word fighting to, which allowed the United States to take on, and the boom really helped. So, in terms of economic policies, I think from the 1991, India was on the right track, and we are seeing now the effect take place. And let me just say a few sort of surprising angles which I think are helping India. One is, I'm now convinced that the outsourcing boom, which would have tapered off, India had a very lucky break. During the last presidential election in the United States, as you know, at one stage, John Kerry opened up an attack on American companies that were traitors to America in some sense because they were shipping out their work to developing countries. I have to say, in fairness, Kerry pulled that remark back, but it was too late. It was out there. Then there were television commentators who went wild with this. Lou Dobbs, evening after evening, would come out and say that just because there's big profit to be made, there are these companies that are sending out their work to the third world countries. And primarily India, of course, was coming up. Now, advertising on American television that you have a resource which you can offer to American companies is extremely expensive. Small Indian companies providing outsourcing would never have been able to do the kind of advertisement that they got as a byproduct of these people saying that, look, just for money, these companies are going out. Small companies in America which were unaware that there's such big profit to be made, suddenly they became aware. And I think the second boom that came to India, the outsourcing boom that came, is really small American companies catching on that, look, if you've got 4 persons over there providing secretarial help, 2 of them you may need over there. So you may want to just walk into that person's room and talk, but there are 2 who are sitting at the computer and working for you, and you can really send that out and make a huge amount of saving, and that was, I think, a windfall that was not really expected, but India got that windfall. I also think actually it's good for the United States, because it's like the automobile industry. If the US had tried to protect its automobile industry, there would be many more automobile workers today in the United States, but it would have been a poorer economy. If the United States tried to protect the textile industry by holding on to its textile industry over there, it would have many more textile factories, but the country on the whole would have been poorer. So it's a blessing for the United States that this advertisement took place, a blessing for India that India picked up. There is also a bit of geopolitics, which is difficult. It creates important moral dilemmas, but it's something that has actually worked to India's favor. February 1989, the Russian-Afghanistan crisis came to an end. A lot of fundamentalists that were engaged over there, suddenly the Muslim fundamentalism in Afghanistan got eased up at that stage. And if you look at the Kashmir crisis picking up, it was within 3-4 months, India's Kashmir crisis became much bigger. Lots of tricky moral questions over there, and the behavior of our country, especially the fundamentalist parties in India, I have just no sympathies with. But it is true that US and Indian interests came into alignment in a way which has nothing to do with any country doing anything. It's a global situation. It's after all the same network. Global terrorism has some of the same networks going. And the United States, in some sense, needed India to balance this off, and India also had some worries about stability, political stability in the country, which brings them together. There is another thing which is happening, which is the China worry for the United States is turning the United States towards the Indian economy in a way that I don't think can be discussed too openly in the United States, because after all, China, in terms of economic policies, is a very major partner of the United States. I mean, corporate America is a voice today for China. So anytime the US government wants to take a position against China, there will be a loud corporate voice stopping that. India is beginning to edge, first of all, a little bit into that. And American politicians, I think at one level they know that the serious sort of political threat to the US, if it were to come, say, 20 years down the road, not at all impossible, it's going to come from China. From no other country but China. So there is, I think, a tilt to, if it is going to, today's unipolar world is loved by the United States because it's unipolar, with America being the unipole. But tomorrow's unipolar world is something that the United States does not want, because if it is unipolar 25 years down the road, it will be a Chinese unipolar world. China also at one level does not want a unipolar world of today's one to continue, because it's a United States unipolar world. So I think India has been treated as a sort of third big power which can also neutralize any single global economic power coming into play. And if India can play this politics well, again with difficult moral questions, which fortunately I don't have to go into that because I don't craft policy on this, but if India can play this well, there is actually economic gains to be made. A year and a half ago, I was in Singapore for a conference of India, China, and the United States being held in Singapore, where Lee Kuan Yew came and gave their initial address and spoke just glowingly of India, which, if you followed Lee Kuan Yew in the past, is a complete surprise. In his book on what's it called, the Singapore story, he's completely dismissive of India. That this is a lumbering giant that's very inefficient, you don't have to worry about this. Suddenly there is a change of tone taking place from Singapore. I've been told, these political experts tell me, that there's a lot of geopolitics taking place over here. The Strait of Malacca sees a shipping traffic through their freight traffic, which is bigger than any other narrow strait or canal in the world. It's the most, it's the largest sea freight that is going through there. There is a worry, first of all, that if it gets disrupted through any terrorist attacks, it's a problem, but that's another matter. There is a worry on the part of Singapore and the United States that the Strait of Malacca, being so close to China, just south of Singapore, that it can be controlled by China altogether. If the Strait of Malacca gets controlled by China, then China is sort of getting a control over the crucial geopolitical nerve of the world. So India is now being encouraged to carry out naval exercises in that area, and these things don't happen without an American nod. And it's again an effort to neutralize a little bit of China's growing power. I think the United States is more or less reconciled that another 20, 25 years, it will not be a unit. It won't be a world where United States is the global power. It will have to shift. If it is going to shift, it's better to have it shift to a couple of countries, and China for sure will be there, and India is the other possible candidate. I say China for sure will be there, but of course in life, in the life of an individual or in the life of a country, there are no certainties and things can go wrong. There can be a political turmoil which can bring things to an end, even for India. I mean, if there is a war breaks out, if there's a major war between India and Pakistan, that will sort of flatten out big cities, that can flatten out the future of the two countries, so who knows. But leaving aside such dramatic possibilities, China is almost certainly going to be there, and for the United States, India is being used to balance off. So geopolitically, it's a great time for India to capitalize on this. Let me say a few more things about one of the things that worries me. It worries me globally is the inequality and poverty situation. And I think India really ought to pay a lot of attention. And you people, most of you will be in corporate life subsequently, which is a bit of a pity. Some of you should come into academics. It's great fun. But most of you will be in corporate life. I feel corporate culture is, human beings are cultural characters. People often assume that human beings are endlessly selfish, which is just nonsense. I mean, all of us are endowed with certain norms, and these things can increase and decrease, and we can begin to adhere to some norms. When we feel everyone is adhering to some norms, we begin to do that, and there may well be changes. What worries me about the current situation is the growing inequality. The growing inequality is, however, a very big problem, not just for one country, but for a multiplicity of countries. If you look at India, these are the numbers we more or less are sure of now. Poverty. If by poverty you take a poverty line and percentage of people below the poverty line, this is called the head count ratio of poverty. So let me just call it India's poverty rate. India's rate of poverty is going down from the late 1990s. 1998-99 was the big survey of the National Sample Survey, and it is now almost certain that the percentage of people below the poverty line has gone down is actually virtually certain. Left and right across the ideological divide, people agree that the percentage below the poverty line is going down. Whether the percentage below the poverty line is going down sufficiently that the absolute number of poor people is going down, can you see that need not happen? Population is growing. So even if the percentage below the poverty line goes down, the absolute numbers need not go down. But I think most people agree that from 1998, 1999, even the absolute numbers is going down, though on that there is a small dissenting opinion saying the percentage is going down, but absolute is not going down. If you want to get that, India changed its statistical methods of data collection in 1998, 1999, creating some fascinating problems. I will not go into that, but if someone is interested, I can tell you, which fed into the controversies. But poverty is going down. Inequality is going up. Whether you are a left-wing academic, whether you are a right-wing academic, whether you are a clear-headed academic who does not allow ideology to change your numbers, especially, of course, if you are the latter, you will agree that inequality is going up. Inequality has been going up for a couple of decades. It's going up sharply over the last decade or so. Inequality, however, is going up in a particular way. Since poverty is going up and inequality is increasing, it should immediately be clear that it's the top end which is stretching out. So the bottom end is rising slightly, the top end is rising sharply. And there has been a study by Toma Piketty and Abhijit Banerjee which looks at income tax data, and the top, what was it, top 0.1% of the top 1% is really becoming rich, and that's feeding into the rising inequality in India. There is a sharp rise in regional inequality in India. What should be done about this? I will address that briefly and then I will stop and I will move back questions. Before I answer that, many people will immediately say that, look, you should go for this measure, tax, transfer, etc. But sharp measures, the inequality worries me a lot. In fact, to me, in the end, a country's development has to be judged by the development of the poorest lot of the country. So, growth is important, but only to the extent that it is feeding into the bottom. The top end can take care of themselves. It's the bottom end that should really be used to judge a country's welfare. But it's not easy to try to reach that bottom end, and if you try to reach that bottom end through wrong policy measures, you can in the long run stymie the country's growth and hurt the bottom group even more. The reason I think it's a hard problem is if you look across countries, inequality is increasing virtually every year. United States, very large crisis in inequality, a whole lot of people writing about it, Paul Krugman writing about it regularly, when he's not busy writing about America's messed up Middle Eastern policy, which is probably the most important thing to write about because it's an awful policy, but also when these economies are turning to inequality, American inequality is rising. Inequality is rising in China in a very big way. Chinese inequality is bigger than Indian inequality. The latest is Japanese inequality is rising. Japan was one of the most equally distributed income countries, it's rising. What's happening? My feeling is it's a concomitant of globalization. Globalization is bringing markets together, and the top skilled people are moving around like capital moves around in relatively open economies to wherever the best opportunities are. So the top end is beginning to command salaries which are very good because they are becoming mobile and moving across from one country to another. And even when they are not moving, capital now being mobile, a country that has a lot of very skilled force will bring in capital. The capital can fly to another country where the skill is available. We don't quite fully understand that, but I think it's a bit of a global situation. Given that the root of the growing inequality is a global problem, if a single country tries to go for a very rash policy action to try to immediately plan for its inequality increase, you'll probably cause a flight of capital to another country, which in the long run will impoverish the country and hold back your poor people in a worse situation, which is what troubles me about India. We used to all the time talk about inequality, battling poverty, but in the end we've done worse than so many other countries. The state of Bengal, which has always, like Kerala, which has always talked about the importance of tackling this problem, but I think it's nothing else but foolish policies, which really in the end did not realize that people all over big business, they are working in the interest of profit primarily. Yes, they have some other consciousness, small amounts, but primarily it's profits. You have to keep that in mind. It's the world where you can't just preach them and expect them to stay here and employ people. You have to provide for them. And in the end, you begin to do worse in terms of poverty, in terms of illiteracy, unless you intervene in an intelligent way. I think we need some amount of global policy coordination across countries on policies of equity and poverty. When it comes to, say, labor market policies, we do coordinate across the world now. International Labour Organization is doing that a lot, and International Labour Standards movement is a very big movement. A lot of it is very protectionist. One country trying to stop another country from doing something, but there is this movement. When it comes to trade policies, we now realize that in today's globalized world, in terms of trade policy, you do need coordination, and therefore you have the World Trade Organization. When it comes to policies for tackling poverty and inequality, there is very little global coordination of policy. So I do feel that the richest people should be clamped, but no single country can do that. If you try to do that, you're going to cause the best people to fly out of the country. You need a coordinated policy to keep the top end of the income clamped and pull the bottom end up. And the top end, if you're really looking at the world's top, say, 1% of the population, they are fabulously rich. And you can afford to hold that down if you can redistribute, I think, without cutting into incentives, but this has to be a bit of a globally coordinated policy. You know, 2 years ago, I did these calculations which are sort of stuck in my head. If you take the 10 richest people in the world and look at their annual income, that is equal to the full national income of Burundi. 11 million people of Burundi every year earn what the 10 richest people in the world earn. I feel when, say, 50 years later, if the world is a better place, more equitable place, we'll be shocked when we look at these numbers. The way we today feel shocked that once upon a time there was slavery when one group of people whipped another group of people, whereas at that time, you must remember, those people thought that that's normal. Some people, to control them, you have to use the whip, and that's the way to live life. Today we take these inequalities as a part of life, but I like to believe that there will come a time when we look back and we will be shocked that a few people were allowed to corner this. Fortunately, I think some of the, within the US and maybe even some in India, the very rich people are intelligent enough with some social consciousness, and the position that some of them seem to take is if these are the rules of the game, of course we'll do as well as we can. But some of them virtually are saying, if you read some statements by Bill Gates, that in some ways the world ought to have a different set of rules so that there is a better distribution. This awareness is there, and I think that's the reasonable thing to do. If you allow some people to make it, the people with the greatest talent are going to exploit the system and do. So you need systemic change in the world to bring this together. Can I take another 5 minutes on one sort of political economy problem? I'm sorry, I'm giving a very sort of back and forth talk, so I probably won't come to me and research, but one remark. One global problem that worries me, a concomitant of globalization, I've written about this, is, and I think a lot of the global political problem and things like terrorism is an awful term, but a global political problem and political violence has roots in this. I feel that with globalization, there is a tendency for global democracy to erode. It's a concomitant of globalization in a very definite sense, I mean this. See, let's suppose that each country becomes democratic, somehow. Middle Eastern countries become democratic, Asian countries become democratic, each country becomes democratic. Will the world be more democratic? Not necessarily, if the following thing happens. In today's world, increasingly, as you have economic globalization, capital flowing from one country to another, goods flowing from one country to another, it's possible to sit in your country and tighten the screws, economic screws of another country. It's possible for a variety of policies. The United States has something called the Sanders Amendment, which is a law, which says that if some country uses forced child labor, the US will ban the import of that product, which will immediately apply pressure on that country. This is a good legislation, but there are some horrible pieces of legislation. Pieces of legislation to battle Cuba, drawing in a third country that trades with Cuba, it just does not seem right, and Cuba is a small country to use the might of the United States does not seem right, but it's possible. The United States can take steps today in the US which will affect the Iraqi economy more dramatically than what Iraq's prime minister or president will be able to do. So think of it now, and likewise for India and smaller countries around India, China and Taiwan and smaller countries around China. These countries, there's disproportionate scope for influencing well-being in another country. Now, what does democracy mean? Many different things, but one of the minimal things is the leaders who can influence your life and well-being, you should have a vote in the choice of that leader. That's the minimum requirement. Of course, there are many other things that are a part of democracy. Now think of an Iraqi. For an Iraqi, much more important than the Iraq election was the last US election. So in principle, if you really have global democracy, first of all, everyone all over the world should be allowed to vote in an American election, because that president's choice is hugely important for you. And small clusters of country, probably Sri Lankans, should have some vote in the choice of Indian Prime Minister, etc. That's of course not going to happen, but there are global organizations which I think ought to be run much more democratically, because these can at least provide some amount of global democracy. My feeling is, as the world is coming together economically with globalization, inter-country influence is becoming much bigger, but since we don't have institutions of global democracy is eroding, because people who have the power to influence your life, you have no say in the choice of that person. Now, some people will say that, look, the rich will of course have greater power. So United States has 17% of the votes in the World Bank. So every decision by the World Bank, 17% of the votes get cast by the United States. Some people will say that's fine. The US contributes the maximum to the World Bank's funding, so why not? But just imagine how primitive our notion of global democracy is, that fact that we give that argument. If today in a country someone says that Azim Premji or Ambani should have extra votes in India because they pay more taxes, I hope they pay more taxes, because they pay more taxes than others, or if someone says Bill Gates should have more vote in the United States because he pays more taxes than others, you'll immediately be shocked. You say the whole thing of democracy is that you cut off the political rights should have nothing to do with economic power. One person, one vote should have sanctity. We don't have that globally. I don't know how that problem is to be solved. But to my mind, some of the political uncertainties in the world with groups feeling marginalized is because the world is economically coming together with political democracy retreating in the world. So this is a large problem for you all to think about. On that note, let me end and through questions I'll be happy to speak more. You'll have to speak a bit louder.
There was an opinion I came across a few years back which said that the emergence of a country at a global time is accompanied, if not preceded, by the emergence of a global corporate giant. And countries like the US, Japan and Germany seem to conform to this view.
It's preceded by a...
Preceded, if not accompanied.
But, I don't know. In the case of India, that is somewhat true, but not really about China. The global corporate presence, if you look at third world countries, very surprisingly, it's in fact India, which is in the clear lead. And this is beginning to come up all the time. You'll be seeing this very soon. There has been some recent evaluation of the quality of professional corporate governance. And India is actually being rated very high. So it's possible that India's rise as a global power is a lot to do with the rise of the Indian corporate world. But China is a bit of an exception to that. When China was beginning to take off in 1978, 1980, especially when it was just coming out of the umbrella of a communist control. It's still a communist government, but only in name. But when it was first coming out of that, the corporate presence of China was not big at all. Nevertheless, the economy was booming, and China is booming bigger than us. So if you just take some single examples, one can think of counter-examples to that, but India seems to be conforming. Yeah?
Sir, in your talk you mentioned the increasing disparity in...
You may want to speak louder so they also get to hear the question.
In your talk you mentioned that there's an increasing disparity in income levels. The top 1% earn much more than below 1%. How much of that would you attribute to the structure of the Indian economy, given the fact that we have grown much faster in services vis-a-vis manufacturing?
This big inequality, the top and the bottom, how much would be attributed to the structure of the Indian economy, in particular the rapid growth in services? Here is my answer. The service and the manufacturing growth, India's manufacturing sector growth has been very small. The services sector is shockingly large. About 50% of our national income value added is coming out of the services sector, unheard of in a developing country. To that, my response is a bit of a market response. That you don't force the economy to have the manufacturing sector, first of all. There are several people who are saying that, you have to expand your manufacturing sector. No, that's the whole thing about a market economy. Some countries have some strengths, and you have to allow those countries to pick up on those strengths. Having said that, there may be some blocks which are policy blocks on the manufacturing sector. You want to remove those and then allow the forces to come into play, the market forces. My hunch is that the services sector will continue to do well simply because of our prior investment in higher education. Unless we mess up our higher education, the services sector will continue to move, which is well and good. But manufacturing sector, I would not give subsidies and go in for interventionism to improve the manufacturing sector. But I would remove some stumbling blocks from the manufacturing sector, and there are stumbling blocks on the manufacturing sector. And I can name two immediately. One is we used to have the small-scale sector restriction, that a lot of products were kept deliberately under the small-scale sector, so you could not produce it in factories with more workers, with more electricity, some definition. You had to keep it small. This we realized over time. This India's learned the hard way. Once global trade opened up and with the removal of the quantity restrictions, Chinese products started coming in. You realize that if you produce in the small scale, if you were making a policy for the whole world, it would be fine. Force everyone to produce the same product small scale. But if you're in a global competitive world and China is producing in a factory with 20,000 workers, and you're trying to produce the product with 200 workers, you'll be competed out. So the small scale sector, there is a retreat of policy. India is now opening up, throwing everything to larger production. The second stumbling block, which to my mind is a big one, is labour market policy in India. India's Industrial Disputes Act, 1947 Act, places restrictions on hiring and firing rules, very stringent restrictions. I mean, globally, there are some industrial countries, France is tougher, Italy is tougher, but across a whole range of countries, India comes out as very difficult to hire and fire and restructure your labour force. Manufacturing depends a lot on this. And one of the sectors which I think the Indian textile sector would have boomed very rapidly if this stumbling block was removed, the labour market policy. But labour market policy, again, you have to be careful. It just revoking the law, Industrial Disputes Act, if you amend it, or if you altogether jettison the Industrial Disputes Act, the way we did with our Foreign Exchange Regulation Act. In itself, that will not change things because it's the culture of labour. Again, I want to clarify something. There are economists who will say that we need to do this in order to help Indian businesses to boom. I think we need to do this because we want to help Indian workers. It's a shame that so few Indian workers are in the organized manufacturing sector. This is precisely because firms are scared to open up with large number of workers because you will not be able to downsize your factory. If these laws are changed and the culture of labor forces change, I think in the end the manufacturing sector is going to grow and that should pick up a lot of the labor slack. However, my belief about the world economy is that in the long run, people will begin to capture output through patenting and through shares and financial control. People who are relying entirely on their labor in the global market is going to get a shrinking pie, and this is going to cause a global labor crisis someday, where too much of the output that is being created in every period is already being cornered by people who have patents on products, ideas they are earning, people who have shares they are earning, the amount being earned by the labor is going to shrink. This is just my long-run feeling about the world. India does not have to worry about that because our labor is still so cheap. This is a problem I would expect industrialized countries to be hit first. So yes, for India the simple answer is remove a lot of these blocks that are currently artificially in place and then allow the manufacturing sector to grow to the extent that it will grow. I think in India, services will still dominate, but manufacturing should grow. And for the next 20-25 years, we should not have a major labor crisis if that happens. Let me take this and then I'll go back. Yeah. Being totally trustworthy is never in your self-interest. In the end, it's ideal thing is what Groucho Marx had once said, that if you can have the reputation of being trustworthy, that's ideal, and then not be trustworthy. That's the ideal, because there are other sort of halfway houses, and one semester I taught the MPID program at Harvard, which is a 1 year or 2 years, I just taught one course, program called Masters in Public something, which is with a lot of economics. And there, about half the class was people who were in the corporate world, in NGOs, etc., from all over the world, who had then come back to take this degree. They did not want to go into full-fledged economics PhD, but wanted to do that. Harvard has that, Princeton has the Woodrow Wilson School, there are courses like that. There are other smaller places, some smaller places with better programs actually there are available for that.
So this might be a little specific, but what are the criteria for these courses? What do you look at? Because a lot of the jobs that we'll be joining will be quite unrelated to economics directly at least. So outside of job, what is it we can do to...
So to study economics, the job experience will not happen. If you're going to a regular PhD in economics, I don't think that's going to happen in your application form. But I know the Harvard program, they do like people to have outside experience. So again, they are not looking at what particular experience, but the fact that you've worked in a decent company, decent job, etc. is
very essential thing, even if you are looking at the YPP program that you work on.
Even YPP is, I don't know what percent of that YPP, but the bulk will be PhDs in the young professionals program. Yeah, that is the case.
That's the case with ADB. Is that the case with ADB?
ADB, I don't know exactly how they hire. It's even more by who you are and who you know. World Bank is much less that. I mean, still the institute matters and those things, those tables matter. But ADB, I get the impression it's a lot of that. And then the government quotas are also very important. So India will push that, look, you need to have 4 more Indians over there, and very often these will be Ministry of Finance people, etc. So in principle it's open, and I have lots of friends who work there, but I have a feeling it's more difficult to break in anonymously into the ADB than it is to, if you don't know anyone and you're trying, and knowing doesn't mean sort of good friends, you have to know someone who's critically there or a government that's pushing you. Most people don't know people like that. In that case, your best bet is the World Bank and the IIF, and the others are secondary in terms of chance. Yeah.
So I'm very average in academics, but it seems that there is some kind of interest which I'm catching slowly lately. One thing is, I don't know what my interests are specifically so as to do pursue a particular field. Is there a way that I can figure that out? Because this thing is haunting me for quite some time.
See, if you want to avoid the sort of technical end of the subject and still get into economics and academics, there are some programs called development studies.
So it's not about, I'm not confused about what in economics, but exactly like what? I mean, I'm sorry, but it's a rather stupid question.
Yeah, but will you give me the question in other words?